This is Talk Business and Politics with Roby Brock.
And welcome to this week's show. We're glad to have you with us. I'm Roby Brock. Earlier this week, Republican presidential frontrunner Donald Trump called for a ban on Muslims to travel to the U.S. The highly controversial statement dominated national political headlines all week long as the political class reacted. I caught up with Arkansas's junior senator Tom Cotton late Thursday from Washington, D.C. to discuss this and more. Let's talk a little bit about probably what's been the most talked about story of the week in politics, and that is Donald Trump's remarks about Muslims. He has proposed a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States. Do you agree with that position?
No, Roby, I disagree with that proposal. I think it would be counterproductive. I think on the one hand, it's important that we recognize that we do face a war against radical Islamic terrorism. That's a very small percentage of Muslims worldwide, but that's a very large number of Muslims because there are over 1.5 billion worldwide. But on the other hand, I think it's also important that we recognize that while we might win this war in the short term on a military front or an intelligence front if the president changes his course, in the long term, this is an ideological fight that can only be won by the help of moderate Muslims all around the world in countries that are already allied with us and trying to help us win this fight, like the United Arab Emirates and Jordan and so forth.
Well, there is a lot of fear about the fear of the unknown, and people that do not know Muslims or the Islam religion do have a fear that anyone could come to the United States and commit some of the acts of terror that we saw in San Bernardino. What would be your approach to a proper way to screen entrance to the United States in terms to perhaps protect from those types of terrorist attacks?
Well, Roby, we do need to examine the way that we screen for visa or refugee programs. For instance, the visa waiver program is an important program that promotes tourism to the United States, to places like the Buffalo National River or the Clinton Library or to Hot Springs. About 36 to 38 countries benefit from that. But we need to have a system in place that ensures that people, for instance, who have traveled to Iraq or to Syria in recent times, or perhaps who come from some of the most violent neighborhoods in Europe, have to get some kind of screening before they have visa-free travel to the United States. The shooting in California involved a woman who came here on a fiancé visa. Perhaps we need to look at screening fiancé visas more carefully. And then, of course, the refugee policy from Syria. Director of the FBI, Jim Comey, has said background checks are only good as the databases against which you check, and unfortunately, Syria is a war zone, and it's very hard to conduct those kind of background checks. So we have to be very clear-eyed and hard-nosed about the kind of security screening we can do, because even if we want to let some people in to this country who are victims of war, if we can't guarantee that they're not terrorist sleeper agents, then we probably need to make a different decision.
One of the other things that has come from San Bernardino is another call for gun control. This is an age-old debate in Congress. There seems to be a stalemate up there. I don't think this would have remedied the situation in any way, but it has been talked about to not let someone own a gun or buy a gun that is on the no-fly list. Does that carry any weight with you? Should people on the no-fly list not be allowed to buy a gun?
Well, Roby, I was very disappointed with the president's speech last weekend. He's a wartime president, but he doesn't seem to recognize it. He spent more time on ineffective gun control than recognizing the failures of his own counterterrorism policy. You're right that none of the proposals the president has made would have stopped the attacks in California. In fact, the kind of weapons that Farouk and Malik used in San Bernardino were already banned under California law. It just reinforces the very common sense point that terrorists, just like criminals, don't go into Walmart to get their weapons. They find them through the black market, on the street, they use straw purchasers. Moreover, I think the president is being somewhat demagogic about the no-fly list or the terror watch list. The FBI does in fact receive notification anytime someone on those lists does buy a gun and gets a background check. That goes to the FBI's counterterrorism division, it goes to the local FBI field office. And finally, I would just point out that those watch lists are notoriously inaccurate. In fact, the Department of Justice Inspector General announced in an audit just a few years ago that almost half of the names on that list are inaccurate. Senator Ted Kennedy, before he passed away, famously was struggling to fly on many occasions because there was a similar name on the no-fly list. Stephen Hayes, a well-known conservative journalist from Fox News and the Weekly Standard, likewise found himself on the no-fly list. So I think we should think carefully before we adopt ineffective gun control policies that would deprive Americans of their constitutional rights without notice, without a hearing, and without any real due process, particularly when they wouldn't stop these kind of terrorist atrocities to begin with.
All right, you have advocated in the wake of San Bernardino to reinstate the metadata collection that was part of the national security code before that law lapsed. Phone records, things like that, that could help monitor terrorists or potential terrorists. You've been criticized for that by a conservative group, Freedom Works, who said this is Big Brother on steroids. I know you always love those types of comparisons. Are you not worried, though, in wake of what you just said about government invasion of privacy, that this could also lead to government invasion of privacy?
Well, Roby, I don't think we should have moved away from the old telephone metadata system. Let's be clear what we're talking about here, because many folks were misled by those in Congress and opponents of a robust counterterrorism program when Edward Snowden leaked the details of this program. This is not the contents of a phone call. This isn't even personally identifiable information about a phone call. This is simply the numbers involved, the date and the time and the duration of the phone call. That's information that Americans already willfully give over to their telephone companies, but it's the proverbial haystack. It's what allows us to look for the needle in the haystack whenever we have tips about a terrorist plot or investigating the aftermath of a terrorist attack when there could be follow-on attacks. It just stands to reason that that will be a much slower and more cumbersome process if we're going through telephone companies with all the legal hurdles they may throw up than if the National Security Agency has that information. Moreover, the time period in which that information is being collected is now much shorter. Reports are coming out in the last 48 hours that suggest both Farouk and Malik have been plotting for years to undertake this kind of attack. It'd be much better if we had that information going back years so we could see the kind of contacts they were making 2, 3, 4 years ago to try to identify other potential terrorists or sympathizers and supporters for terrorism. And we simply are not going to be able to do that under today's system. At least I haven't received the assurances that we will be able to do that.
Let me shift gears and bring us to an issue here in Arkansas. It's actually got a little bit of regional appeal. It involves the Clean Line project. You and some of your other fellow senators and congressmen have expressed some concerns to the Department of Energy about that project, and property rights has been kind of the biggest issue in that respect. You met with the Department of Energy this week. Did you get any of your concerns addressed, and has anything changed your mind, and what might change your mind on that project?
Roby, Secretary of Energy Ernie Moniz met with Senator Bozeman and me and all 4 congressmen from Arkansas. All 6 of us are deeply concerned about this project. We sent a letter to the department a couple months ago. They recently responded to us, but I have to say it was mostly generalities. Secretary Moniz did discuss in more detail today some of the answers to the questions that we had, not only about the infringement on property rights that private property owners in Arkansas might have to bear, while federal land doesn't bear any of those infringements, but also about the commercial viability of the project, as well as what would happen if the project went bankrupt. So Senator Bozeman and I have placed temporary objections on 2 nominees to the Department of Energy until we can get detailed answers to those questions. And until those answers are forthcoming, then we intend to continue to hold those nominees.
Give me an answer to a question that would allow you to lift one of those nominations, or perhaps give you assurances that that project should be green-lighted.
Well, so the fundamental question I have is why the Department of Energy in Washington, D.C. thinks that they will know better than the Arkansas Public Service Commission, which declined Clean Line's request to be a public utility 4 years ago without prejudice, which means that they could have reapplied to Arkansas. I think Arkansans, both at the local level and the state level, know a little bit better about what should and should not be a public utility in Arkansas than the Washington, D.C. bureaucrat in the Department of Energy does. Until we can get fundamental answers to those kind of questions, I just don't think that we should move forward with letting our objection to the nominees go, or for that matter, Washington, D.C. using a power it's never used before and making this company a public utility in the state of Arkansas.